So welcome. Burgundy Masterclass, I think number 3 even now. As I said, we've been in Groundhog Day for 120 days or thereabouts, and hopefully not much longer, but welcome. I'm not sure who here has a affinity with Burgundy, who here has loves their wine, who here just loves wine, and who here just is desperate to get out and not listen to their partner each Wednesday night. So a show of hands if you have had the benefit of drinking Burgundy in Burgundy, or it's something that's of intense personal interest. Great. So for the rest of us who are like me, we're the gifted amateurs, I will keep this conversation. It's about making it fun and enjoyable. I'll try not to delve too heavily into the world of winemaking, maceration times, fermentation temperatures, and the like. Happy to talk them through. Sometimes I think there's a couple of times I will get into a little bit of wine discussion in that technical side, I think, because it's relevant to explaining the differences between Burgundy in particular and Australia, and us and the rest of Australia. But really, we're trying to blend together the cultural significance, the historical story of Burgundy, the geological story of Burgundy in particular, and we'll hopefully talk about it through our wines. I've got a PowerPoint presentation. The benefit of Zoom is normally if you come and see me do a classical wine dinner, you have to follow me word for word, and there may be someone drunkenly talking next to you, or frankly, I've just talked for a long time and your attention starts to wander. The benefit of this is I can show you Zoom and you can follow. I don't have to paint as many pictures with my words, and we can talk, and you guys, you're more than welcome to ask as many questions as you want. Raise your hands, jump in, rebut aggressively. I don't mind. This is supposed to be interactive and fun with a structure around it. So I will start off by sharing a really nice big presentation. So Burgundy Masterclass. So great little fun play on the signs here. This is the Route de Grand Cru. Some of you may be fully aware of it. Obviously, the beautiful driving street through the middle of the vineyard area of Burgundy, north and south of Beaune. And I've cheekily put de Beaurepaire wines due through the center of the earth, 12,742 kilometers. So a little bit of background. Burgundy, it's interesting. So we're doing these virtual classes, master classes in Bordeaux, Champagne, reserves and sweet wines, and Burgundy. Burgundy has the most, I guess, significance to us as a family. We are historically a Burgundian family. Our family is actually still in the same home it's been in since 1395, and still with we're still in contact, and we all still talk. We're a very small family. We have a proliferation of females, me included, now with 2 daughters. There are very few men, so there are very few of us. There's only about 1,000 people with the surname in the world. In terms of, I guess, the locality for us, we started our winery in 1998, but we actually first started making wine in Australia as a family in 1970 in the Yarra Valley with my great aunt and uncle. My cousin Hugh is still making wine there and in the Mornington Peninsula under his label Mr. Hugh, but the family winery there was called Murrindindi. It was just near Yea. And we're obviously Victorians. New South Wales is a big jump, especially these days with everyone getting very parochial with their states. It's an important, the background to us being there. It's very much us being focused on being a terroir producer, really going back to our Burgundian origin story. As I sort of said, our surname, it doesn't mean good repairer. I know that there's probably some burnt rubber and retread that could be discussed about this evening. But the actual name broken down, especially as you go back 1,000 years when the name first started appearing in texts, it actually means from a beautiful hideaway or sanctuary, which I think sort of captures what we've started to build up at our little town of Rylstone, which we will go through as well. In terms of a nutshell, we did reasonably well in 2018, where we won Best Wine in Australia. And I think that sort of sets a little bit of the background as we go through. I'm responsible for wine and vineyards with my father, my sister, and my mum. We're all fully committed in this business. My sister's in charge of obviously the direct and consumer side of the business and a lot of our back-end operations. And my mum, besides being the glue for the family, also carries the big stick and makes sure we don't spend too much money from time to time. And then the next generation, as you can see, Annabelle is there, and now with Sophie too. So, and Megan, my lovely partner on the end. So, a lot of people ask why Rylstone, and that's part of the story tonight. And what do you mean when you talk about being a French style producer? And I think this is sort of what we're trying to capture. There is a big difference between Australian wine in terms of the way that it's evolved and the way that we tell its story and the way the French express and talk about their stories. And in a nutshell, the way that we see our ethos, it's about finding elegance and balance in our wines, which is really, really important. And that's discovered in the vineyard as much as it is in the winery. It's about being able to produce wines that age. You know, that you can use a lot of tricks and sleights of hand in the winery to make wines taste good young, but they won't age for very long. And that's fine. 95% of wine is drunk within like 24 hours of purchase. But for a great wine, the ability to be still good at 20 plus years, to me, is a real benchmark of a legacy type of wine. We are still very much in the early stages of our story, which I'll discuss as well. We are also looking here about focusing on the vineyard. So we've got a very special little bit of terroir, which we'll discuss as well as we're going through this. And we're also about trying to capture the variations in seasons and vintages. So you'll notice in our range, there will be holes. We will not make a wine in years that we are not comfortable with the quality of the fruit. You can't fight Mother Nature. I know that in Australia, you can blend that away. You can buy and bring in a lot of grapes. We do not do that. Everything is single vineyard. And that's really important for the way that we look at this as well. And also nowadays, it's about improving the vineyard and the land and the soil that we have developed. And so sustainable is one function, but I think regenerative is now the new approach. And so using new techniques that improve what we've been given. And that's, if you walk through our vineyard rows, they look like a vegetable garden full of radishes and turnips and the like, because we're using things like green manure and the like to rebuild the organic matter, which is really important for feeding the biome within which the vineyard operates. So that's sort of the French approach. So it's elegance, it's got variations, it's very vineyard driven. But before we go into a lot more detail, I think, I've noticed I've done these where I talk, and at the end I go, let's talk about the actual wines, and people sit there and go, can I drink now? And I'm sort of, haven't you been drinking from the start? So one, you are allowed to drink as much as you like, starting now or about an hour or 2 hours ago. So we'll talk very briefly, and then we'll go back into the terroir story about Chardonnay, because the first Chardonnay, and there are two Chardonnays, are obviously a very much maligned variety here in Australia. I think this sort of captures it. I think when you talk about the background of it, the ABCs in particular, after their initial planting 100 years ago here in Australia. And that has a lot to do with I guess the formation story of Australian wine. We talked a little bit about the French influence in Australia isn't substantial in the wine industry. When you think of how important it is globally, and you think of the varieties that Australia planted, pretty much all being French, the actual French approach wasn't undertaken. And we planted vineyards all over the place, everywhere. And that was especially in the early days. And we planted Chardonnay in incredible variations of climates, some with great success, some with, let's say, maybe not overwhelming success. And one of the things that we did do is we planted a lot of Chardonnay in quite warm climate. And those of you who appreciate the acids in wine, there are 4 in wine, 3 in grapes, and the 3 in grapes are tartaric, malic, and citric. I don't want to talk them to death, but they are important. Tartaric acid is sort of the back cheeks of your sort of feels a bit like tannin in terms of that location with acidity. Malic acid is more like apples, and it's sort of as it's coming towards the front, and citric acid is right at the front. It's naturally lemons and the like when you're tasting on your palate. And as a grape ripens, as the acid starts to degrade and I guess the development of sugars is undertaken, you find that that the malic acid is the first acid to go, and you're left with citric acid and tartaric acid. And there's a process in winemaking. It's very dangerous. It's acid fermentation. It's called malolactic fermentation because it's supposed to be undertaken with malic acid, but the yeast, the acidifying yeast, not acidifying yeast, the yeast that actually interact with the acid will attack any acid that's there in various proportions. And when that process is undertaken in citric acid, it creates a buttery kind of wine. And that was one of the big driving features. That's why a lot of warm climate Chardonnays without the malic acid, they would go through this process and you'd end up with these butter bombs. There's other ways as well that butter was also developed, but that wasn't the main style. You do want to get some creamy nature from it. Malic acid becomes cream, but citric acid becomes butter. There's sort of a varying proportionality here. That was the first step for the ABCs. The next was a lack of appreciation of the use of oak. So we would just buy barrels for our wineries. You've got to put in perspective, 40 years ago, Australians didn't really produce a lot of premium wine. We were not long out of being fortified producers. The first families of wine in Australia were mainly fortified, sherry producers and the like. It was really the great work done in the 80s and 90s and by a number of wine. So there's some early ones like Chester Osborne and Cudkay and the like back in the 70s, but the 80s and 90s where you had some of the other labels, the Len Evanses of the world and the like, who started pushing Australian wine overseas. And a lot of them, were just very gifted amateurs, and they were, well, we want to make a great Chardonnay. They use Chardonnay in Burgundy. Okay, we'll bring the cooperage up and say, I want 50 barrels. So I want 30 for my Shiraz and 20 for my Chardonnay. They were red wine barrels, very coarse grained, very heavily toasted. You can see this toasting process here. It's interesting. Toasting was only discovered in the 1970s. Toasting in the French mentality was about heating the wood up to be able to bend it into a barrel. The Americans took that a little bit further in the 1970s at Mondavi and started actually burning the wood to release smoke taint. And in a barrel, the smoke taint is a vanilla essence comes out of the barrel, and they found that was really lovely in red wines. So you actually started getting this massive release of vanilla and oak integration from the coarse grain red barrels, the wrong barrels. So we had these oaky, buttery Chardonnays. That was the ABC world. Obviously, things have moved on from there. Modern Australian Chardonnay. So this is now the new era. So post 2000, I would say, you started hearing about cool climate. So Tasmania in particular became the buzzword. We started understanding a little bit about oak. We understood that, wow, so there's coarse grain oak and there's fine grain oak, and coarse grains for red wines and fine and super fine are great for white or wines that you don't want to have a large interaction. We started understanding toasting, the fact that the burning of the barrels, the French, as I say, don't burn their barrels. Some of the more inventive producers in Burgundy will, but really it's very lightly toasted. They're just enough to bend the staves into barrel form. And that was sort of step one. Step two was, 2010s, we started talking about yeast more intelligently. There was a real wine is made as a chemistry project in the 21st century that in the 20th century, the 21st century, it's become much more about working around nature, and yeast is one of those. There is a main yeast, the baking yeast, the alcohol yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae. It's really important yeast because it's the only yeast that really works well at high alcohol levels, and those above 5% to about 15% alcohol levels, which obviously wine is consumed at or made at. They don't work very well below 5%. And what would happen is we used to sterilize the wine, and then we'd introduce or bring in inoculated yeast, bring in the cerevisiae, the Saccharomyces. And the net result was you lost that first 5% fermentation. It sort of wallowed along and then it took off. What happens in the native yeasts, and we'll talk about it a little bit, is that for the first 5%, they're everything, and they're having an enormous part to play in the expression of wine's flavor. They have a massive impact on flavor and the characteristics of some of the great wines of the world. And fascinating enough, the yeast that you actually find in some of the wineries in Burgundy are very unique as well. They have their own biomes. So if you look at the ceilings, they're obviously, hygiene wasn't a great one. Brettanomyces was a big battle they took to get rid of, but that was an important understanding feature for us. So starting to become more green and regeneration, using sheep, cutting out sprays, organic, or whatever you want to do in that regard. The understanding that, all oak isn't good, and pulling back from oak. The French use very old oak, like Chablis uses 30-year-old barrels. I call oak the rich man's curse. And the reason behind that is it's expensive. And especially in the Napa Valley, wineries are owned by billionaires and they're used to throwing money at solving problems. And oak, you've got a problem, you've got a wine, well, oak's expensive, more of it must equate with a better outcome. It's not true. So even Burgundy and Pinot is a 20% new oak. So using mixture of old and new, trying to work out the right configuration of oak to be used. And the future, well, the future for Australia is really interesting. It's the introduction of robotics. And that's, I know it's been fascinating, but Australia's always been a technologically advanced agricultural nation. We don't have Eastern Europeans, South Americans coming in with cheap labor to do all of our work. So we planted, we did our agriculture based on using tractors. And that meant we planted straight, long rows that had no appreciation or relationship with the underlying soil geology, underlying with the contours, so different temperatures. So in a row in a vineyard in Australia, you will get many different levels of ripeness. Some will be underripe, some will be overripe. You're picking averages when you're using machinery. Now, obviously, if you're hand picking, great, but especially these days, good luck finding anyone around who can hand pick, though I'm willing to take names after this for a presentation tonight. So it's not fun work, but it seems good. It's like everything in wine. It looks good from the outside, but not so great on the inside. So what we're doing and what's going to happen in wine is the ability to appreciate, and you can see on the right, actually, that's like a ripeness plot, or it can be any plot at all. And it identifies what's ripe and what's not. And then you compute that into your harvesters and away you go. You can start harvesting the ripeness when it's ready. They're called VinBots. They're quite amazing. So using drones, there's all sorts of technology coming. So that will enable Australian vineyards to really move up the quality scale quite dramatically in a more general sense. As I said, if you can afford the hand picking, you're sort of doing that already. But those are extraordinarily expensive Chardonnays. So the first Chardonnay, obviously, that you're having is, I just want to make sure I got to the right slide, sorry, it's dropped out of the presentation for some reason. That's right, is Le Comtesse. So the Le Comtesse is very much our low intervention school of Chardonnay. As you'll notice, when we talked here a little bit before about this malic to lactic conversion, none of that's been undertaken. So we've got a very high acid base for our wines. We have a very cold climate, which means our acidity is naturally very elevated, pretty much to almost the same level as you see in Chablis. And by not touching them, you keep that sort of apples, that very fresh, that very fruit-driven, almost sweet acidity they're playing on your palate. We've also mainly used steel tank, so 20% through barrels. So you're really, you're also making them more reductive. So you don't have what's called micro-oxygenation or micro-oxidation. All it is effectively is some oxygen gets into the barrels and that enriches the wine and it makes it more oxidative style of winemaking. Reductive winemaking is where you make it effectively an impermeable layer, you use sulfur dioxide and like whatever you do, you're trying to not let oxygen into the winemaking process. It's really interesting in terms of, well, about maintaining the freshness of the wine. So this style of wine, we've intentionally tried to make as fresh, as fruit-driven, as playful as possible. It's a great wine to start with. It's a veranda wine for a lot of people who sit in the veranda and open many bottles of it. Not overly complicated. It's a very terroir-driven approach. So in terms of stylistic ways, It's probably ends up more like a Petit Chablis, but in terms of the winemaking approach, it's more like a Chablis in general, which in some regards use no oak, as I said, maybe 30-year-old barrels, and they're all about reduction there. And I'll talk about them a little bit as we talk onward. But I thought we'd start you off, give you a little bit of a taste of the first of the Chardonnays. It's yeah, I think a nice way to go. 2017, very easy to drink. So, little bit of background of Burgundy. Always nice to set a little bit of bit of presence. Where they're originally Scandinavians, interestingly enough, Roman auxiliaries, and effectively took the land as the Romans retreated. They just said, "Well, this will be our region," and this was overturned then by Charlemagne in 533, and that they were incorporated into his great kingdom under the Franks. It was then split in two between the Holy Roman Empire and France around 1000 AD. These are sort of important because a lot of these actions filter through to the viticultural practices and the varietal selection of Burgundy. Because during the 100-Year War, the king gave to his youngest son, interestingly enough, so not through inheritance, but actually bequested his youngest son Burgundy. And that younger son was Philip the Bold, who's an interesting character. Quite very smart. Younger son, I think he never had any illusions that he would actually ever run anything. Obviously impressed his father enough that he thought him a safe pair of hands to look after Burgundy. He was a massive wine lover too. He produced, it was called the Edict of 1395, and it's called the Gamay Edict. And I don't know if you've read up on it, but effectively he banned Gamay being planted anywhere in Burgundy. He ordered its entire removal within 5 months of this edict. Now, it's interesting, he called it a very bad and disloyal variety. I don't know, maybe he had a very bad hangover from it, but the point is that he was ruthless. And what was in this edict wasn't just so much the attack on Gamay, it was the attack on poor winemaking practices. So he spent a lot of time, and this is quite a substantial edict. He wrote personally about practices that vineyards should use to maintain quality. So reducing yield in particular was a big one. So weren't allowed to use fertilizers. He also made the vineyards move up the hills. So he realized that one, that made better wine, but two, he needed the valley floors for growing wheat for his armies. So these types of decisions have fed into what has now made Burgundy these days. It was the home of the Cluniac order, which out of Cluny, the Cistercians, probably the most boring of the sects of Catholic monks you could possibly find. And that was to our advantage. They were the ultimate clerks of the monk world. They would literally sit outside and record everything. And they did that for 600 years. And those 600 years of record keeping has enabled Burgundy to identify 1,400 individual micro terroirs. They call them climats within their region. And it's fascinating what they were able to do. But it's enabled them to effectively give us the foundation upon which you know which is a great Burgundy wine and you know which is a bad Burgundy wine, all on their vineyard. And giving them also effectively recipe books for what to do in every vintage. Winemaking is not seen as a highly aspirational role in Burgundy or in France in general. Their vineyard is what they name themselves after. It's where they see themselves tied to, and all the prestige is located on their vineyard. So all of this led to them being an incredibly powerful, wealthy region. And that, as you see, if you've been to Hospice de Beaune and you see the beautiful towns, enabled them to keep a lot of this region without having to sell off to foreigners. Like it's also being a long way from the coast, unlike Bordeaux. They didn't have the involvement of the Dutch or the English, who obviously pretty much did a lot of the build-up of Bordeaux. And quite a unique spot. They call it the stomach of France. There's also, interestingly, a lot of French cooking techniques come from Burgundy. So that's sort of a bit of background. Nice to sort of bet ourselves in the wake of it. The way we talk here is the Burgundians and the French view themselves by around their terroir, around their vineyard location and its site characteristics. In Australia, we sort of do a little bit. We talk about temperature. And that sort of seemed to have been, especially in the 2000s, as you saw, and it's dying out a little now. And it's also has been much more complicated in some areas, but in general, you hear a lot about if it's cold, it's good. If it's warm, it's bad. And to me, that's a little misleading. If it's cold, it's good for French varieties. If it's cold, it's bad for Southern Italian varieties or Spanish varieties, but vice versa. If you want to grow Grenache, Nero d'Avolo, Touriga Nacional, Tempranillo, all these varieties that are becoming quite aspirational and make amazing wines in Spain, Portugal, and Southern Italy, you can't grow them in cool climates. So, it's sort of a little misleading. I think it's important from our perspective. France is generally quite cold. So cold was important. Cold is one characteristic of what makes French wine, as you understand, is there's a lot of the same temperature in Burgundy and a lot of difference in quality of vineyard. So you can see us there at Burgundy Wines. I know we've got the people here from Ralston on here. They appreciate how cold it gets. It was -6 last night on our scanners last night. Ralston, I'm happy not to be there. We're around the same temperature as Champagne through the growing season. It does not matter the temperature during winter. It matters only once they go from bud burst. Well, in the lead up to bud burst, the soil being warm obviously accelerates bud burst through to senescence when the leaves fall off and they go back to sleep. So it doesn't matter if it's under snow or not. It's this key period, which is everything. And you see incredible variety. I sit on the New South Wales Wine Board. There's a lot of New South Wales wine regions up here that make magnificent wine. It's not an indictment saying they make bad wine up. It just means that we were ruthless about following this French terroir. We had to go looking for something similar. So temperature was one. It's really important because to grow great wine, it's about, as I said, balance. So it's about getting the right variety, ripening at the right rate with the right amount of hang time, which gives you the right fruit, the right acidity, the right tannin. Interestingly, tannin ripeness is really important. And you'll notice it because underripe tannins are very bitter and astringent when you're having the wine, and green in particular with Cabernets, and not in the right amount of alcohol. So this doesn't come from temperature. It comes from a variety of factors. The French talk about terroir much more abstract than we do, and we will tonight, because let's be honest, we can't replicate the culture here. I can probably get you all some serviettes and we can swirl them around our heads and do our own little poulet. But the climate we've talked a little bit about. We've talked about temperature-wise. What about inland versus maritime? So continental versus maritime, really important delineation. Topography. So are you on river bends? Are you on the slopes? You're on the valley floor? Is there a hill above you or below you? Are you in a cold channel? They call them fans in Burgundy, where the soil has been splayed out and eroded down the hill. The grape varieties that you obviously have picked, the flora and fauna. We touched on briefly, the importance of working with the biome and the yeast, the natural yeast, the native yeast that you find in the vineyard. But also we're finding as well, working with the local insect predators is of a great advantage. So the use of insectariums. So you're looking to use ladybirds and lacewings to fight the bugs rather than sprays, and they're much more effective. I always thought ladybugs were really cute, but apparently if you're a bug, they're pretty terrifying. And soil. Soil is one of the problem which we'll come to. It's probably a very, very critical ingredient. But the big one I always try and draw people's attention to, sommeliers in particular, is you can name all these great Australian winemakers, but you can't name many French winemakers. But you can name the best French vineyards, but you can't name Australia's vineyards. And they sort of, I get it. And there's just a difference of construct here. Australia, we have large wineries producing good quality product from many vineyards. There is an art form and a lot of experience required to do that, to get consistency of product. There's a chemistry level of knowledge that is far beyond mine. The French approach is you get what you get. It's the vineyard. So, don't mess it up. There's a reason why you spent a lot of money or you built the vineyard where you are, represent it. And that's why they don't actually even have a term for winemaker. If you type it into Google Translate, winemaker into French, you'll come out as vigneron. And when you do hear them speaking using English, they will perhaps say wine grower, but really they call themselves vignerons, and their whole quality scale is based on the vineyard. So if you're a negotiant, you're buying other people's fruit, you're a long way down the scale, and it's especially the same with champagne. So, okay, so the French approach, what does it look like? We can show some data that sort of shows how things work and where the differences are. Obviously, temperature remains on the left. Let's keep temperature in there because France wants to be a bit cooler than south of France. But you start noticing that it's concertinaed out and across a horizontal scale, and that's really driven by soil pH. And that's a really critical area because you notice that it's amazing. All the French regions are in a really concentrated location, a dynamic here. And you can see them. The variance between Bordeaux and Burgundy in a glass is substantial, but from a soil pH and temperature perspective, not a lot of difference. So Australia, obviously, we're older soils. They've had a lot more rain leaching through them. Rain is acidifying. They're also volcanic soils. Volcanic soils are naturally quite acidic. So what is it that makes all the French soils mildly alkaline? Why are all the vineyards located on these? This is what we're going to touch on. But also, let's be frank, is some of these other regions in Australia produce magnificent wine and some of the best wine easily in the world. And I think dollar for dollar, we probably should always buy Australian wine. This is a guidebook, not a rule book. So for us, being ruthless about our vineyard, this was important. But when the push comes to shove, the product in my glass is magnificent, all of this falls away. So what we're trying to show here is it looks complicated. It's not. This is a little bit about understanding Burgundy in particular. So we'll break it down very simply. Obviously, cool climate we've got that nailed. Okay, so what's the next step? So difference, you saw Burgundy and Bordeaux, reasonably similar temperature, but quite dramatically different wine styles. The big difference is Bordeaux is down here right on the coast, and has what's called a maritime climate. And Burgundy's in this dark green area. It's an area which is called a continental climate. Those of you, Ralston, Curragh, the desert, anyone who's gone west of the Blue Mountains or inland a long way from sea will realize very quickly you get what's called diurnal variation. Diurnal variation means big differences in temperature between day and night. And that's because you've lost the regulating influence of the ocean. Those, especially on a sand dune, would notice it even more, but soil can accentuate that process. So that's why, for instance, orange is a bit higher than us, but a bit warmer than us because it's on volcanic rock. It does retain a little bit more heat than we do and than Burgundy does. And what they found, though, what's important about diurnal variation is that if you go back to that balance, it's about getting things to ripen at, in line or in synchronicity together. So you're talking about sugar or alcohol, we're talking about acidity, we're talking about flavor, and we're talking about tannin. Those factors, if they are out of balance, stop you from producing great wine. It's very hard. Some varieties in particular, and the varieties we're looking at tonight, are very hard to get in balance. Pinot Noir in particular is the hardest variety to grow and make. And what these cold nights and hot days do is you get the photosynthesis operating, that engine of creation effectively, and it creates, the alcohol, develops the ripeness of the sugar during the day, and then it stops at night. And that process enables the flavors to ripen, the flavors to develop in the wine. That's quite important. So you've got the stop, start, and they're each operating in conjunction with each other so that when you get to harvest, you don't have a high alcohol wine and low flavor, or high flavor, low alcohol. And it's sort of, you have this place where things are right, but you also have tannin ripeness because long hang time gives those tannins time to ripen. So tannin is, when you're talking about structure and age worthiness, you're talking about the acidity level. Acidity is one of the greatest preservatives available. We use it often, but in wine, it gives it obviously a lot of time to age in a bottle and holds a wine together. The other great foundation is tannin. And it's probably best represented by the cat's tongue that you feel inside your mouth, that dryness towards the back of your palate in particular. It's really important for longevity. And you achieve tannin or get tannin into a wine by two major sources. There are a couple of other minors, but the major ones are skin and oak. And so if you've got thick skins and the skins have ripened, there's been time, and I'll explain how that happens. You get these lovely tannins, which means you can pull back on the oak. And if your skin tannins aren't there, you dial up the oak to increase the tannin hit, or you use things like stems and the like. But from a tannin ripeness perspective, it's really important to also be aware that tannins, wine is effectively a living organism. These things are polymers. And what that means is that like Lego, they combine together given time. In a bottle, so young tannins, like Lego, I'll use the Lego analogy, the little pieces of Lego, they hurt when you walk across them with bare feet. So young tannins in your mouth are sharp and not that enjoyable. But as a wine ages, the polymers, the tannin Lego pieces click together, become Duplo or become bigger and bigger, doesn't hurt so much. Then they actually become quite enjoyable and they become softer and really lovely. That's normally requires aging. Hang time enables that process to happen on the vine. And we see that with our Cabernet in particular. We have very long hang time. That's Felix is now doing all of that down at Great Southern. Virginia Wilcox does probably one of the best explanations of hang time and tannin ripeness I've ever seen. Probably worth looking it up on the Guild of Soms. But you get these lovely tannins that develop, they're riper, skins are thicker. And so you get, these different types of Pinot. Burgundy Pinot is a medium-bodied wine. It's not a light wine. You just need to look at their cooking. Problem is Australia, most of our Pinot is on the coast. It doesn't have time to develop these thicker skins. We use a lot more oak, and we use Shiraz to build out its flavor profile. That's not an indictment, because blending is one of the great dark arts that's underused in wine. I've got no problem with it if it creates a better wine, but it's not a Burgundian Pinot, no matter what people say. So that was sort of step one. Step two step two. So cold, inland, but that doesn't represent why Burgundy is so small in terms of the plantings. So the orange bits here are their best bits. The green bits are the not so great bits, but the white bits means there's no vineyards planted there on the map. And the first thing you'll notice is that Burgundy, the best bit of it in particular, is this area called the Côte d'Or. It's the northern zone between, it's the Côte de Beaune and the Côte de Nuit. So famous for Pinot at the northern end and Chardonnay is at the center. It's a bit of a gross generalization. They make great in both, but it's only 60 kilometers long. And the best bits of it are half a kilometer to maybe 1 kilometer wide at its widest. And some of the really best bits are only a couple of 100 meters wide. So this straight away says that temperature and inland location are a very small part of the story, because the valley next to it is the same temperature and the same inland location. Why is it not covered? Or if it is, why is it not making great wine? And that secret is all geological. And stepping back, taking yourself back 150 million years ago, this starts to make a little bit of sense. So there are two main basins in France, the Aquitaine Basin and the Paris Basin. And they are defining features of viticulture in France. You'll notice Armagnac and Bordeaux seem to sort of hug around the Aquitaine Basin, and Loire, Burgundy, Champagne's not really in the, but they sort of seem to follow a bit of the Paris Basin and Burgundy. And there's a little bit of extra bits and pieces where there've been some other basins and other areas as well that are formed around the Rhone Valley, parts of Provence. They're really important because you've got to take yourself back, as I said, 150 million years ago, the era of Sam Neill and velociraptors in Jurassic Park. And you straight away realize that at that time, the continents of the world was a great supercontinent called Pangaea, and it was starting to break apart. And as it broke apart, the great seas around it started filling up the gaps and flowing into the low points, these basins. And the Paris Basin and the Aquitaine Basin became shallow seas at this time. So very warm seas. This is effectively the climate. It was on the Mediterranean as well. On the equator. And there weren't any tiki lounges, unfortunately. You probably were in a very hostile environment. But on these coastlines are effectively, you can see Burgundy was on the coastline and Champagne was actually just off the coast. So shallow seas. So what does that mean? Well, straight away, there are two life forms that are really important, and one is plankton. So plankton were rich in this shallow sea. As they died, they laid up these incredible layers of chalk. And this here, you can see on the right in Champagne. And then in Burgundy, which was on the coast, like Sydney, you get deposits of shellfish, so oysters in particular in Sydney, but back in that era, all sorts, pippies, like you can actually see here, a vineyard on the right in Burgundy, 400 kilometers from the coastline with a fossilized shell. So all these soils were full of limestone. So coal is the descendant of compressed dead trees, whereas limestone is shells and chalk is plankton. So this is where it sort of starts becoming clearer, because coastlines aren't very wide. If you remember the width of Burgundy's plantings, and you were to walk down to Sydney Harbour and you're trying to work out how far out the shellfish go, they don't go very far off the sea. If anything, they're probably 10 to 20 meters off. But the estuaries and around behind coral reefs, the like, you start getting thicker zones of shellfish being laid down, and they're the zones on which Burgundy planted the vineyards. So, and it's really important because the limestone is effectively, for any gardeners out there, you've dealt with it. You've had a tomato plant in the back garden that's struggling. The way you overcome that is you use some ag lime, perhaps. Maybe you're a bit more organic, or you love eggs and you put eggshells out there and crush them down. You're adding calcium to the soils. Calcium is, it's good to know, calcium is an alkalizer. So if you remember those vineyards in Tasmania that produce magnificent wine, how do they do it with a pH of about 5? They do it because they spend an enormous amount of money each year or every couple of years on wine, and they crush it up and they spread it around. So they attack this problem from the surface down. Burgundy, Champagne, Loire, Bordeaux attack it from the bedrock up. So it needs to be shallow, it needs to be near the surface to be able to effectively weather or wash into, to be spread through the topsoil. Because being mildly alkaline, you can actually see them here. That's why the soils are all out here are all influenced by limestone and chalk. So pretty obvious, they don't plant where there's not limestone. They don't plant where there's not chalk. Interesting to see the Germans got it. So the Barossa Valley, Coonawarra, the Terra Rossa, Eden Valley, Limestone Coast is a bit of a giveaway. They are on limestone. Rest of Australia, we didn't, because we were planted by Englishmen who were not heavily involved in the wine industry. They had some maybe trading relationships with Bordeaux. The Italians were here. Northern Italy is some of my favorite wine in the world, but they didn't come here to make wine. They ended up being great fruit growers, and they were focused on the irrigation areas. The French weren't allowed probably in Australia till well after our colonization, well after invasion or colonization. Because we were having a couple of battles like Trafalgar and Waterloo in that period of time. So weren't exactly welcome. So there hasn't been the same influence and appreciation of this. So what does lime and what does mildly alkaline mean? Why are the French all there? It has purely to do with nutrient availability. So vines, like humans, need multivitamins. They do exactly the same things that they do for us: immune responses, skin health, verdancy of foliage, the color of the skins. They play a large part in the health of a vine, and the same way multivitamins play a large part in the health of a human being. And in this environment, they're more available. As you can see here, most of the key ones seem to be most available, between 6.5, which is up to about 7.5. They then start dying off again once you get to alkaline. So what does that mean though? Because if the vines are getting all the nutrients they need to be healthy in a much more easy fashion, it means that those soils are what's called more efficient. So you don't need as much soil to provide the nutrients to the vine. And so this whole adage, I hear it every now and then, it still springs up, strangely enough. We've got these great deep soils. And I sit there and go, are you planting oak trees? Because vines are not for deep soils. That's human psychology. You want them in shallow soils. And there's a really important reason for that. But the shallow soils have got to be nutritious enough so the vine's healthy, especially if you're going back to, we want to work with nature. We want to make the vines fight their own battles against disease. And we want them to have the nutrients to produce the characteristics of fruit that we want. But we don't want too much of it. And there's a reason for that. And it's shown here on the left. The left is a table grape and the right are wine grapes. And the first thing you'll notice is the size of them. So the grapes on the left are full of fluid, full of water, full of moisture. So maybe irrigation is a key one. But the other one is, think of soil as a water reservoir. When you've got shallow soils and it rains, you've only got a certain, maybe half a meter to a meter of moisture from which to drink from. If you've got 3 meters or 4 meters deep, rich soils, great for growing your carrots in, but for vines, it means they just keep drinking. And so what happens is your berries get bigger, the flavor dilutes, you get less skin to juice. And these are, the aspiration of wine is that you want to have a water-stressed grape. You want a healthy vine to support it, but you want a grape that's really struggling to get enough water so that it's tiny, it's small, intensifies the flavor, intensifies the sugar. And that's what limestone does. It gives the soils the ability to be tilled, to operate, to sustain a vineyard on a very shallow basis. And you want proof in the pudding? Here's the Louis Roeder at Cristal's vineyard, 50 centimeter deep soils before you hit the chalk layer. This is the most expensive champagne in the world, behind Salon. Or Domaine Romani Conti. It's really, really shallow soils, 50 centimeter deep soils. This is the most expensive wine in the world. And the way that they achieve that shallowness in Burgundy, the reason why the best bit is so narrow is it's not just limestone, it's the depth of the soil above the limestone, and that's influenced by erosion from the hills. So remember Philip the Bold banning, pushing people off the valley floor onto the slopes? Thanks to him, that was effectively what created the great wines, because at that mid slope, the erosion is just the right amount to provide just enough surface soil to support the vine. And as you go down the slope, you get where all the eroded soil has gone down. It's called colluvium, out to the valley floor, and the soils get deeper and deeper and deeper. And that's the cheap Burgundy. So that's sort of 101. This is why the vineyard for us to find this was so important. But this is just the steps to, effectively, a quick summary of the steps to it. The way that obviously Burgundy and the French have developed it, but Burgundy more appreciates it more than anyone. And that's got a lot to do with the Clunic monks providing such incredible record keeping. But limestone gives efficient soils, means the vine is healthy, means that they don't need to be deep, so they can be shallow, means they're water stressed. The net result is you get more intensified flavors and structure. So that was the Holy Grail. It's a long-winded way of saying shallow soils with mildly alkaline are, what we were looking for. And it's the basis of Burgundy. So let's talk about the other Chardonnay before we get into us. I love this term. It's goût de pierre et fusil. So all it means is a taste of gunflint. So when we translated this into English, we got a little bit off, and you would have seen this. You hear a lot of people talk about Chablis, and you say it's mineral. I love how mineralized it is, and I can taste the terroir in it. The French don't say that at all. They say it tastes like gunflint. And what they're saying here, and it's really interesting, and this comes back to how wine is made, is the way to think of what that is suck on a pebble or strike a match. So, it's actually a sulfur type of impact. And sulfur comes from, remember I talked a little bit at the start about wines being oxidative or reductive. So the absence of oxygen makes them reductive. One of the reductive traits in wine is sulfur. Is this goût de pierre et fusil? This is the Chablis school. people think of Chablis that it's mineralized because the acidity is so high. The acidity was so high, they then take it down a notch by doing that acid fermentation, but then they put it in barrels or tanks, increasingly these days, or cement, and they don't touch it. 22 months, 26 months, they don't stir it. They just let it sit there, it self-settles, and they make these amazing wines off it. And it feels mineralized, but in reality, it's a beautiful, rich wine because it's had that creamy nature come in from the Malo, but it's kept that tight palate from the reduction. So it's always love that term. So it's just a good one to know that the French don't call it minerality, they call it gunflint. So we talked Chardonnays. This is interesting. So how I talked about how the best bit of Burgundy is 0.5 kilometre wide. This shows it. This is Chassagne-Montrachet. So this is one of the greatest areas of Chardonnay planting in the world. You've got the scale up here at the top, 500 meters. So that's your premier cruise. So this isn't even your best. Right here, this little bit here, that's literally about 400 meters by 400 meters is the Grand Cru area. This is the wines that are ridiculously expensive. So it's very specific. So the temperature and the climate, they were important for selecting Burgundy as an appropriate place for Pinot and Chardonnay to get, but the limestone was important. Then it was the slope and the hill where you are, and the hill is important. But also here, it's quite crazy, some of the stuff where there was a fence, built 800 years ago, and it pulled the cool air above the vineyard and enabled you to have just a little bit more ripeness just below it, or something like that. To me, what defines Grand Cru over Premier Cru is Premier Cru can make often as good wine as Grand Cru. Not often, but it can make as good wine. But the difference I find between Premier Cru and Grand Cru is Grand Cru makes it every year, whereas Premier Cru makes it every now and then. That's the difference of it. So from this perspective, you're starting to talk about the much more heavy-hitting end of wine. And I guess this is where we're starting to go with the Jeanette. So you can see here on the left, La Comtesse, which was a wine designed to be fresh and fruit-driven, much more steel tank, to the wine on the right, the Jeanette. It's got a bit higher alcohol. 2019, it's interesting. 2019 was impacted heavily. These are the drought years. We're not going to be harvesting at 14.2%. Well, it's about 14.5 Beaumet again. But that's the problem. This is where warm climate, you can be a cool climate. This is climate and droughts and the like will throw these curveballs at you.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
The notes that you sent have 2018 Jeanette.
Yes. What wine do you all have at the moment? Which wine are you drinking?
The Jeanette.
Yeah, which vintage on the bottle?
It says.
Yeah, John's got our bottle.
John's got your bottle.
It's 2018.
Okay, easy. It's actually it's about. Actually, you know what? 1 second. I'll tell you. I've got my. It's just. I started updating it because I've actually started changing over 2019. Apologies, you guys. The 18 is actually a better year than 19 is good. 18 is a magnificent year. I feel. But the Jeanette 18 was about 13.5. So still around 13.2. So it was 12. I don't have the bottle in front of me. That would help. With 3.2 pH, TA, tradable acidity of still around 7.
You want me to hold it up for you?
Yes, please. Or just read out the alcohol. I've got my pH registers here. I deleted it off because I'm sitting in an attic at the moment. I've only got. It was a cooler year, 2018, so it should be much lower.
12%.
Yeah, 12%. Good. Yeah, it should be. We want to be harvesting and making our Jeanettes around 13, maybe 13.5 maximum. 2019, which we were showing you, got away from us a little bit, but it's made it interesting, a bigger Chardonnay, and it's a direction I want to go because one of the things I'm unhappy about with the Jeanette, to be frank, is that I want to do more malolactic fermentation. So that acid fermentation we talked a little bit about, it's 15% in this. I want to take it up to about 70 to 80%. This was effectively, a lot of these benchmarks were set down before I was involved. Chablis is full malo, 100% malolactic fermentation. Our acidity levels started around the same level, 3.2, 3.15. It's important just to say is Chablis is able to do this and maintain that quite fresh style because its starting acidity is so high. That acid fermentation reduces the acid down. And if you've got a low acid wine and a white wine, that's not good. Then you're going to dose it back up with tartaric acid and you're going to play with it to make it better. But we don't do that. So this, we've been sort of playing around. We didn't have the confidence. The people who are advising us, the problem for us is that we're a new region. And people we're talking to were in Mudgee, which is about 4 degrees warmer than us. And they're like, oh, 15%. And now through experience, I'm probably more 60 to 70%. I also want to dial down the oak. I want to dial down the lees stirring to maybe once a month, if that. I just find that, there's a potential there. We're going to do a couple of trials in the next couple of years to make it a little bit more fun. So we'll maybe split the two, may continue one like this, and we'll continue one down my new pathway that I want to take this wine in particular. And then we can always blend them back together again, or we can produce 2 more wines, because 17 wines is just not enough wines for us in our portfolio. Either way, this is one of the great things. We're able to experiment over long periods of time because we're a family winery. So our yardstick's different. So Dad and I are planting hopefully another 20 hectares in the next 5 years, which will take us up to 75 hectares of vines planted. It's a huge amount. It's 50,000 case equivalent. And that will mainly be Chardonnay and Pinot because we want to start building out this area of the business much more. And we now know the clones that we want to use, the root stock that we want to use, and the areas we're much more confident now in. And we also know the vine orientation. We want to look at those things. So when we first planted in 1998, our knowledge and the people we talked to, none of them had any experience with what we're doing now. They were fantastic, but now we've got a bit more confidence ourselves. So there'll be some changes. But the point from the Jeanette is we're looking for that much more involved style of Chardonnay, and much more central Burgundy was the initial claim, but I think it actually comes out more like a Chablis than a Meursault. It's not rich enough to be really into that Meursault category. It doesn't need to be, but it's more an appreciation, understanding of the fruit that we are working with. But you'll notice the difference. Obviously, very fresh fruit with the La Comtesse, and a little bit more creaminess, a bit more richness with the Jeanette. I want to amp that up in the next couple of years. The 2019 is quite substantially amped up in that richness, and that was purely to do with the fact that it was a riper year. Interestingly, though, it was riper, as you can see here, but the acid was higher. It's crazy. Yeah, it's a titratable acid, but the 3.2 pH with 14.2% alcohol is nuts. So, and that's that's the conditions that we're on. So you've got any questions about the Chardonnays that you're having there?
Well, both of them are lovely. So
yeah, different though.
Very different.
Are they both from the same vineyard?
Yes, every wine we make is from our vineyard, single vineyard.
Yeah. So effectively you've taken the same fruit and you just got 2 totally different styles.
Correct.
Mm.
So,
sorry, our cat's whinging.
No. Normally my daughter is up in my lap at the moment, climbing over me and screaming. I did a wine dinner 2 weeks ago, and she was yelling from about 3 minutes behind me, chocolate, and the whole wine dinner is like, Will, can you stop and get us some chocolate? So no, she's downstairs, which is surprisingly quiet up here. I'm sort of missing it. This is exactly. So we don't buy fruit in. The vineyard is 55 hectares, so that does mean that it covers 1.5 kilometers by about 600 meters wide. So you're going to get, if you're looking at that map of 1.5 kilometers is about half. Our vineyard's about half this appellation. Okay. So look at the quality differential within that vineyard. So you get an understanding. We're still early days for us, and understanding, appreciating what's our best fruit. We may inevitably make 4 or 5 Chardonnays. We've also got, we've done a lot of work on clones. So not just our Pinot clones, but our Chardonnay clones. We've got 3 different clones, and clones is it's it's like the more you know about wine, the more you realize you don't know. It's like, oh, great, make wine, ferment. And then it's like, well, which barrel do you want to use? You're like, oh, fine, or toasted. And which one? So you're like, that, I didn't realize that. And then the next level is obviously there's yeasts, and what yeast do you use and how do you do it? The fermentation temperatures, and then there's, well, which clone are you using? And that's sort of, let's be honest, is it's like, well, we were looking at doing some lavender farming. We've got a river flat, sandy soil, alkaline, great for lavender. And I rang the nursery up and I was inquiring of pricing for large quantities. And I said, oh, I want the English lavender, lavender in Provence. And they're like, great. So which one? I'm like, well, the one that's in Provence. And they're like, well, there's like 100 different English lavenders. And there's pink, there's purple, there's white, there's culinary, but they're all called English lavender. And it's exactly the same for Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. Not 100, but there's probably 30 to 40 clones underneath each one. And like the English lavender, they are 30 to 40 very different wines. If I was adjacent rows, different clones to make a wine in exactly the same way, you'd think it would be a completely different vineyard or different wine. It wouldn't taste the same. So for us, it's appreciation of the blending tables, which is going to be more important for the Pinot in particular. And I'll get to that as well as we go.
So the volumes that you're producing much greater than in Burgundy, just because the land size you've got is bigger? How does that work?
It's a very good question. We're probably producing 7 tons a hectare on average. So that's, God, it's amazing. It's got about 2.5 to get to acre. So if you do 7 tons, we're getting off probably 60 cases a ton. So it's what's 7 times that 420 cases. 420 cases times 9. I've completely gone off the record. This is where I know with a newborn, my brain. I'm normally like, and then we do this, and then we do this number, and then you do. Now I'm like, it's got to be slow. I'll work it out. I got the calculator. This is what's great about Zoom. I can actually talk with authority because I can be reading things on this other screen going, oh, that's the number. Okay, so 65.
No, I'm just talking generically, like one of those little squares on this map you're showing us.
Oh, yeah, it's.
Would they be producing pretty small quantities?
It depends. Look, they'll probably be producing fairly similar quantities to what we produce, to be honest.
Okay.
Yeah, there wouldn't be much difference.
Right.
Their outcome, their vineyard spacing is much closer together. So they were planted without any thought as to tractors. So the rows, their density of vines is vastly higher than ours.
Okay.
We also initially planted a lot of our early vines decent spacing apart. We've halved that spacing in our new vineyard. We actually find that increases the competition and stresses them more. So you get an increased quality. You also you're developing less fruit per vine as well. Yeah. So we're starting to play around with tricks like that, which is sort of important for us. But yeah, it'd be fairly similar. We've had some pretty gnarly vintages the last 3 or 4. Like frost is a big issue. Last year we lost 90% of our Chardonnay and our Pinot. We had bushfires the year before, and then the year before that we lost 30%, and then in 2014 we lost everything, 100% of the entire vineyard. So it's viticulture at the marginality, at the margins. It's it's where Burgundy gets wiped out, Champagne gets wiped out. It's unfortunately a vineyard where it's an industry. You guys know the great wines come from the toughest locations, sadly to say. So, which means we're idiots for being in the industry and not just drinking it. So that's sort of, I guess, a bit of the stylistic difference here. Was use some more oak. I'm so happy. But yeah, I wanted to create either a third wine or adjust the second wine more in line with the Chablis. I want to see how far it can go with full Malo, more reduction. I want to see what we can create, and then perhaps something which will be more oxidative, more Chassagne Montrachet or Meursault, with more oak and the like in the wine. So this Jeanette is lovely. It's beautiful. It's doing well, but it's sort of, I feel like it's sort of between the two schools when we could make one in each school and probably have even better wine altogether. Project for the next 10 years. So that was sort of the background to Burgundy a little bit. And where does it cross over for us? And this is, I guess, some of the questions. Here's looking from A block down across to B block. You cannot see C block. It's over the next hill. So it shows the distance. So it's 1.5 kilometers from here to the other side of the vineyard. Probably 2. Oh, actually, it's up to 2 kilometers from this corner, but the majority of it's about 1.5 kilometers wide. And then it sort of tracks about 0.5 kilometer, 300, 400, 500 meters laterally across, just to give you a sense of scale. Why?
Sorry. So, Will, I love. Is it an Australian thing to call things A, B, and C? I'm not.
Yeah, I know.
Do the French even think about that?
It's funny. Like it is funny. Like I do say to my parents, we do need to give them better names, like A block. Like, yeah, it sounds like, cell box H, we're going to have some prisoners come out,
Sounds like a jail. Or a
It
boarding
does.
school.
Well, mate, have you worked in a vineyard? It's not that far off. So definitely hard labor. This is, convicts probably had it easier than a vineyard on.
It doesn't sound very romantic, A, B, and C.
Maybe it's La Côte up here and out there. We can, this is the side of the hill. There's a gully in between there. And then there's that hill, and then over the next hill is down to the river. So we could, the La Gauche or what's the La Rive or something. I'll come up with something, And when you do it, you're like
alpha, beta, gamma, delta.
God, we really should have alpha and omega block then. So
I think the French could do something better than the Greeks. Yes.
But it's funny though. It's like everyone goes, "Oh, Australia, how boring are our names? Like the Great Sandy Desert, the Great Barrier Reef, the Blue Mountains." And you're like, "But that's what the French do too. It just sounds better in French, like Mont Blanc, Mount White. It's got white on top. It's just. And obviously, a lot of the French vineyard names are their historical names, like the La Côte, the appellations, like the Côte Rôtie, which is the roasted coast. That was because down in the Rhone, they were making a lot of nuts and the like. So a lot of these were orchards, or they were, walnut, almond, nut farms. So now they really are nut farms.
Just on that. So what was there on this land before you planted the?
Well, this is it. Like, why are we here? Like we're like families. We got family in the Yarra Valley, for God's sake, making great wine. It would have been a hell of a lot easier to open up near them. Mum and Dad go, we're going to make wine next to our family, so we can share equipment and we can have family dinners and we can do things together. Instead, we did a bloody Kevin Costner in Field of Dreams. We've ventured into New South Wales.
What was here before? Cattle or
this
sheep?
This is sheep. This is super fine merino country.
Merino, yeah. So sheep.
Scrappy,
so you come
rocky.
Up with some sheep names. You come up with some merino wool names, maybe.
Oh God, dopey, dumbass. No. I shouldn't say that. No, I hate
Daisy.
sheep. They're dumb.
Anyway.
My mum's parents had this beautiful Hereford stud in the Gippsland, and I love cattle. Sheep, I'm happy to eat because it's like a love-hate thing.
They're dumb animals.
They are. If you've ever tried to take a sheep through a farm gate, you realise frustration. So
well, I'm from Merino territory in Goulburn, so I understand.
Oh, there you go. Yep, super fine micron down there too. So the soils have got to be pretty crummy. Goes back
shit
to
soil in Goulburn. It is shit soil.
And wine likes it too. Not overly lush, pretty shallow, rocky soils, indeed. So this was sheep country. So there wasn't a vineyard within 50 kilometers from here, from Austin. We set up. So we could have, inland climates. There's all sorts of them around. Orange, there's Mount Macedon. There's stuff everywhere we could have picked, but my parents decided to make it harder. But to be frank, with about 1,500 wineries and 10,000, 12,000 different wines out there, if you're going to do like everyone else, you better be doing a bloody good job. So saying that, you got to do a bloody good job out by yourself, but it gives us the ability to be ourselves and do what we want to do with the direction we're taking. It's interesting. Initially, when we were up here, Mudgee was like, "You're part of the Mudgee wine region." We're like, "No, we're not. We're Ralston." And we sort of joined with them initially. Now we're like, "No, we are Ralston." Ralston are very proud people in Ralston. So it's the same, and the same distance between us and Mudgee as it is between Bathurst and Orange. And I sort of explained that to them, and they sort of get it. They sort of get it, but they're also 6 degrees warmer than us, to be honest. So
It's cold. Ralston's not warm.
Ralston's brutal. We're absolutely brutal. Coldest we've got is -14.
Yeah.
So first one was obviously why there was looking around for the cool climates. This is where that latitude discussion you sometimes hear thrown around. You know, if you're below the 37th or 37th and a half parallel, you know, that's great. Well, it's not, because Stanthorpe is as cold as Tasmania. And Stanthorpe's up in Queensland. It's just, you know, stupidly high elevation. So yeah, down here it's latitude, up here it's altitude. So somewhere along the way, there's that zone 7 is sort of what you're looking for from a French viticultural perspective. If you're looking for maybe Spanish or Italian varieties, it might be 6 or 5 or even 4, even, to be honest, sometimes, for especially Sicilian varieties. So this was important for us, step 1, but there's a lot of good wine regions in zone 7. You can see it there, the temperature ranges for us, similar Ralston to Beaune. Interestingly, as cold as Champagne. We're probably actually almost closer to Champagne. And you see right down the bottom there, I put in for nice, is Central Otago, which is to me one of the great viticultural regions of the world. The wines out there are phenomenal. And it's similar, very, very cold. And fascinating.
So it was interesting, go back to Otago, Central Otago, so just because they are amazing.
Yeah, correct.
What's the soil difference?
They have got some limestone there, interestingly. But it's not always about, it can sometimes be, so limestone's one way of achieving it. So the French have done it through trial and error. You can dose the soils up with lime yourself, or you can do things like gravels, where some gravels, there's some peculiar gravels in the world. Gimlet gravels might be one in New Zealand, where the soils are so free flowing that they don't hold on to the water either, but there's just enough nutrients in the vine. So it does come out of different situations. In France, that just wasn't an offer, except for left bank Bordeaux, but that still had, because it's on gravels, it's on actually the old mud flats and swamps of Bordeaux. So it's got deep soils there, but that's why they planted Cabernet, which can handle more water than Pinot and Merlot. But yeah, so they've got a bit of limestone there, but it's just cold.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
It's cold. I mean, it's cold.
Bloody cold. So the real one was soil, and that's the real reason we went there rather than anywhere else. So you remember your Pangaea story with France and how the continents, Pangaea split apart and the water rushed in, covered northern France and left the coastlines with shellfish and chalk on the floors for the wine regions. So Ralston, so go back 450 million years ago, so you're back to Ordovician era. So this is the era of invertebrates, of shellfish. So that was the only life form, the dominant life form with shellfish, and it was Gondwana land. And where Ralston, so Sydney, where we are now, was offshore. There was in a chain of barrier islands, of volcanic barrier islands. And then on the leeward shore, there was a shallow sea before you got to part of Gondwana land. And it's in that leeward shore of the volcanic islands, where you didn't have the big swells crashing from the great oceans out here, that you had this incredible barrier reef system and coastal system, along which incredible quantities of shellfish were laid down. You don't see that a lot. So I'm getting, you don't, so it laid down this incredible system. So you can actually see it here. And this is a nice geological sort of map of Ralston area. And you can see these old coastal regions. You can see the barrier islands of eroding volcanic islands. You can see the shallow sea. It was called the Hilland Trough before it became Gondwana land. And you can see there's limestone deposits that were there. Unfortunately, a lot of the other wine regions all missed it around our area, but not much. But they will probably move some new vineyards into this location zone. And so this is the same coastline of coral reefs and limestone that you see in Jenolan Caves and Wombeyan Caves. It goes a long way north and south. It's just 450 million years old, whereas the Sydney and the Blue Mountains is 200 million years old. So it's been faulted out of the ocean. And there was a lot of volcanoes that came and overlaid this, about 250 million years old. So it disappears and it goes down at depth. Once limestone's at depth, it doesn't matter. It needs to be 0.5 meter to 1 meter from the surface to have any influence. So it's or at surface. So the way you find near surface limestone, you don't walk around with a pH testing kit and you know, and geology, sort of a little hammer cracking rocks up and down. Well, it's already been done, to be honest, by geologists a long time ago. So the way you go and find this is you start looking around, and there's a little town just next to Ralston, not on this map, scarily enough. It's a little town called Candos. And Ralston's have been around since 1830, but Candos has been around only for about 100 years. And it's a mining town, and it was built around one main or two main mines of the same similar persuasion, and they were cement mines. And they were what's called Candos. They produced what was called Candos cement. The Candos cement is so famous; it was called the cement that built Sydney. It's all the cement in the Harbour Bridge, all the cement, and a lot of the original skyscrapers. Pretty much any building from the 30s onwards was Candos cement for a long period of time. And for those who know anything about cement, you'll realize that cement is just crushed limestone. So if you're going to have a cement mine, you don't dig it at 50 meters below surface, but it needs to be near the surface. It's not gold, it's not worth digging a big mine. You want to sort of get straight into it. So this is what we saw. And this is what we look for. We're looking for these cement mines. And there are a couple around the areas, Portland, down towards Lithgow. There's Candos here. There's one up east of Mudgee, actually, interesting, Mudgee, dolomite and lime. And that's, you can't see it here, but it's just off the south. This map is actually the quarry pit. You can see the limestone through the area. You can actually see this volcanic rock that goes over the top. This is what gave the game away. We looked around for where the limestone reappeared, knowing it was there, and we lucked upon it just southwest of this town of Ralston, in this little valley. You can see the aqua rocks are volcanic soils. That's acid soils, pretty crummy, very hard soils. And this Coomba Formation, which is the name of the farm just across the road, where all the limestone is. And we were really bloody lucky to find it. You can see it just disappears again. So yeah, that was Candos. There was the giveaway, and we've been really lucky. So that was what we planted all the vines on. The soil you can see up going up the hills. The limestone actually is at surface up there. There's a lot of it strewn around in the vineyard. And because we get so freaking cold, you get the same frost thaw cycle that breaks and shatters it and spreads it through the soil. So a little bit too much geology here, geology porn. I don't know if sometimes you get the odd miner who goes, "This is amazing. This is wine and mining." I wouldn't have, but from our perspective, it is. It's important. This is sort of a way of ensuring, and that's what got us to get this temperature range and got us to get this soil pH range, which we were looking for. So it's pretty lucky for on many levels, but a lot of hard work and great direction and risk taking by my parents. I'm just here to take all the credit. So, so the Pinot Noir. Okay, so Pinot Noir. You've obviously opened it. I don't tend to spend a lot of time. I don't like giving too much about, can you taste this? Can you smell this? Simple reason, it's very subjective. Also, women tend to have better taste and buds than men. I think it's a survival mechanism. Back when there was more of a foraging type of culture, the ability to determine if something was poisonous or not was a real lifesaver. So my mum and my sister actually have better ranges than I do. Interesting. But it's still nice to know what a Burgundy, and these are some of the characteristics that you might expect to see. The big ones are going to be the aroma profiles, the spices and the like. And the big ones on the right is they're more of a medium-bodied wine. Where this wine, the 2019, is compared to Burgundy it's like that, Jeanette. This is a drought year. It was burning, searing temperature. So it was picked at a much higher Beaumet and alcohol than we probably would have normally picked it at, and it ripened a little bit too quickly. So we didn't get as much flavor development, but I am happy because when you leave it to decant and leave it to get some air to make, in effect, to get the perfumes going, you do start seeing a bit of the spice notes coming through, which to me is really important for an indication of direction, because you don't see a lot of that in Australia unless it's been tricked into it.
Yeah, we decanted ours at 5 o'clock because I took half the bottle to John, and it's tasting really good.
Thank you. It's very tight. That's the problem with the highly acidic wines. Burgundy doesn't. It's hard to explain it. I even find it very hard with us in judging competitions. We taste too different to the lineup, so it's very difficult for us in those situations. but served in the right conditions, yeah, it nails it, which is, but once again, I still think, this Pinot Noir is important because we made our first Cabernet in 2003. So the vineyard planted 98, first Cabernet 2003. So 5-year-old vines. Cabernet is high vigor. It's very high vigor crop. It was able to produce enough fruit to start making wine. We won third best Cabernet in the world about 2006. So very quick turnaround to quality. Pinot 2016 from 1998. So 18 years of development before we were happy with it. So we've always sold the fruit. We built the vineyard around grape sales because we never expected we would make a lot of wine. Anything like the direction we're starting to go in now, where we're looking to expand. So we planted with the intention to sell varieties to other wineries back in the 90s when Australian wine was still Hunter Valley Sem, McLaren Vale, and Coonawarra Cabernet, Barossa Shiraz. Tasmania and Mornington, all these areas that are now quite famous were still very gestational and in the early 90s. And so that was what wineries were asking us to plant when we asked around. So we planted all these other varieties while we got so many other wines. We're happy we did because it's enabled us to have this amazing range with versatile and with depth, which really relates to the vineyard quality, not the winemaking. The winemaking is important for making sure the quality control is there, but the vineyard's what gives us the breadth. But for us, it was just waiting a long time to get enough canopy. It took forever to get the canopy out of these vines. The area where the vines are planted is really shallow soil. Like that area here, it's this area up here is the main, the area here this is actually Cabernet in front of us. But all across and around that hill there is Pinot. And it's crummy, crappy soil, limestone rubble strewn all through it. It took a long time for them to actually get enough vigor to be able to produce what we classified as a balanced type of fruit. So these are early days for us. We haven't produced a reserve from it yet. So we've got, we have four clones planted in production. So we've got 5 clones planted. So we're going back to that, all the English lavender variety sub clones that are there. So they're all Burgundy. We've got a new one which we planted, which is the Abel, which is this Domaine Romani Conti clone, or apparently it is. So they're all blended together. We haven't done fermentation of them separately until this year, 2021. We've actually picked them and made 4 different wines, actually 6 different wines, because not just different clones, but different areas of the vineyard. And we're then going to, we didn't have enough, unfortunately, to make a reserve this year. It's just a great trial run for us to see what they do, because what we want to do, especially from next vintage, is make them, and then at the blending table, God knows when that may be, but 9 or 12 months in, to then go, right, this is the blend to put together, or do we do it earlier? We'll watch them as they go along, and then we'll be able to put a certain quantity back into oak another 12 months, leave it for a couple more years, and that will become the reserves. Whereas this is designed for not rapid release. 2019, it's still a couple of years old, but it's designed for reasonably fast turnaround. So we haven't had the time to be able to expand upon it. Great pH. I'm really happy with the pH range and the acidity levels. But this was the drought year, super hot year. Native yeasts are important. These is actually, I've got some of the things on the left because I find this is sort of the area that the French and the French, the Appalachian system, and their focus on vineyards. There's not a lot that they'll do in the winery, not what they want to do. There's not a lot of leeway they get. So you hear things like the use of stems or not. So whole cluster versus whole berry. So effectively, whole cluster means you're effectively throwing the whole bunch with the stem in. You want to make sure the stems are ripe. So the stems is, as you can see here, this is actually what it can impart in the wine. But the danger is the stems have got to be ripe too. So the way stems are ripe is they lignify, they become wooden. So when you chew them, they're not bitter. But you use them when there's a low tannin year. So when your skin tannins, so when we talked about the use of oak to increase the amount of tannin in your reds, you can also increase your tannins because tannins is obviously a vegetal. It's part of a plant. It's a plant extract. My brain's starting to go to frog here. But so you get it from this here, and it's a great opportunity to improve it. Some years you want to do it, some years you don't. Burgundy, there are absolute schools, but most of them always joke about that they're non-stems, but then, you'll see the vineyard walk past with a bunch of stems and drop it in a fermenter every now and then. So that's a good way of explaining it. So what whole cluster does give you, where you throw in the whole bunch, is it gives you this beautiful process called carbonic maceration, where effectively the wine starts to ferment within the berry before it starts breaking out of the berry and ferments the actual juice in itself. And it can enhance color extraction. It gives a lovely sort of strawberries, fruity, almost bubblegum type of aroma to wine. So it can make it fruitier if it's a bit dull and placid. Whereas destemmed, it's all crushed and pressed and it's all just fermenting normally. So we used here just mainly destemmed with only probably 5% whole cluster. So a very small amount. We don't need the tannins for our wine particularly, but it's a good way of explaining that. The next, try not to go overly complicated here, but we talked at the start about the yeast profile. So use of this, baker's yeast, the Saccharomyces, which you see on the left. So it imparts all of these characteristics on wine in various proportions, depending on the vintage and the variety. Has a large part to play in flavor development. So these choices have a lot of influence. This isn't even getting to the wine tricks that you can pull. But what is really important, and this is what I was trying to get at here, trying to find a better chart of it, but this is effectively the different yeast cultures and within the wine. Actually, they do drop away normally times here in the real world. But you'll notice that it takes quite a while before Saccharomyces gets up. And this is actually a beer yeast. But what we're trying to sort of say is that you start with these native yeasts. They do all the hard work in the first 5% of wine. And that's where we're discovering that a lot of the flavor comes from. And makes really unique, really, really fun flavors. So use of native yeast is really important for us. But fermentation was a bit short. So I want to look at for ourselves, because we're still bringing a lot of production back on site. It was just a cost control for us, making it off site. We just didn't have the money to build a winery. It wasn't worth it as well. We weren't big enough. Is to make a much colder cellar. One of the big comments to make about Burgundy is that the cellars are very cold. And this is an interesting thing with climate change or warming environment, is that interestingly enough, the best vintages in the vineyard are warmer vintages in Burgundy. But the problem is it starts warming up the cellar. And the cellar is an interesting thing because one of the real defining features of Burgundy is a really long ferment. You hear them even fermenting, stopping over winter and refinishing again in the next season. So I find that's really important because a fast ferment can burn off flavor profile as well, effectively. So these are some of the things that we're starting to look at. And the last one here is just not fine or filtered. So a lot of our wines are now vegan friendly, and you might hear people talk about vegan friendly wines. They're vegan friendly by byproduct, not by intention. It's to us a byproduct of good winemaking and good quality fruit. So you've all had your natural wines. I don't know what your responses have been to them. Natural winemaking makes sense. The French are quite natural in their low intervention, but it's garbage in, garbage out. And the problem for a lot of the natural winemakers is they're young, they don't have a lot of money, and they're using crap quality fruit. And natural winemaking means you're not using science to control any poor quality control issues. So if there's a small problem, thanks to fermentation and the aging profile, small problems become big problems very, very, very quickly. So it just destroys the wine too quickly. But if you've got good quality fruit, you can really take the foot off the wine. And one of the couple of those ones here is fining and filtering. I don't want you to go through this. I'll PDF this. You can read it at your leisure. But these are processes to stabilize a wine and to clarify a wine in wines that are made in a more commercial setting. But fining wine, think of it effectively. You can see the wine, it's full of sediment. Think of it like Cooper's beer. On the left, you put a fining agent through, it drops all of that cloudiness or the lees, the dead yeast cells and other sediment to the bottom so that you can then pipe or rack the wine off take the wine out of there, and it's clarified. It's clear. It looks like a super dry sort of thing. Problem is in that process, as you drop them down, you can actually see what these fining agents also do. They're not innocuous. No fining agent, nothing you throw into a vat of wine will make no change to that wine. So they can strip out tannins, they can make it less bitter, they can do all sorts of things. Problem is, every time you do something, we're seeing this by doing smoke taint trials we've been conducting, is even when you take the bad stuff out, unfortunately, it takes the good stuff out too. Because remember, they're polymers. The wine's a polymer, everything's connected together, tannins, flavonoids, everything starts connecting together. And as you drag a bad thing out, it's also carrying with it a whole flotilla of other, maybe more positive requirements. So fining means when you're turning around a wine fast, you're pumping it around a lot in the winery in the early days, you're moving it around. We take a long time making our wines. They settle anyway. They go from here to here just by leaving them alone. So then you just pump them out, or hopefully, which we'll really need to do with our Pinots, because Pinot hates being pumped, is you use gravity feed to take it out of there, which is what I'm really designing into the process. So that's been one big benefit. By doing this was what makes it vegan friendly. So a lot of these products on the right are animal products. That's all vegan wine doesn't want, is those animal products. Now there's vegetable agents that you can use that you're starting to see coming through that replace. Sometimes you do want to use some fining agents, especially maybe for color or in the like. Sometimes up with your rosés, sometimes. But in the main, if your wine is made in a slow, steady fashion and you're not an idiot using it, pushing it around the winery, the wine's already fine by itself. And the other is filtration. This is the one where the natural wines get really screwed up on so you have volatile acids affecting a catch-all and plus other factors as well. But what it shows, what happens is you effectively try and remove these by pushing them through membranes. And membranes of filtration. The problem is you push them through membranes, like fining, you also stop the good flavors and the aroma profiles. We found the aroma profiles in particular are really easily extracted by pushing them through a membrane. So from us and our perspective is if you can stop filtration, you're just keeping a little bit more and a little bit more. We're talking fractions of a percent, maybe a percent of influence to wine, but to make great wine, it is made in the periphery. And if you really want to understand is when you're talking fractions of a percent, you just need to look at effectively, 0.1% is your tannins and your phenolics, your flavors and your other compounds. So you're talking a very small percentage of a wine is what makes it great anyway. So anything that interferes less with that very small percent. And the reason why we can do this is because our fruit is high quality. It's our own fruit. It's from our own vineyard, and we look after it well. So because of that, we can take both out. That's, I guess, the future for us as a wine is really, as I went back to the stewardship, is less intervention, letting the terroir speak, less moving around the winery, less oak where we can help ourselves, more using the native yeast, so the native biome, natural biome to work with it. And that's been a future with that's our current and our future with our wine. And obviously, we're bloody lucky to do it in an amazing environment. Rylstone, the perfect spot as far as we're concerned for doing what we wanted to do, and perfect spot to live in too. So incredibly lucky to be able to make it next to such a beautiful little town that is worth seeing. So obviously, these are always better to be tasted in their environment. So come and see us at the cellar door. We've got some pretty amazing stuff in the area. Look, we're near Mudgee, but stay in Rylstone or come and spend some time in Rylstone, especially this Christmas when it's hot. There's some beautiful water parks or water features in the area, Gangutty or Windermere Dam. Gangutty in particular, you can go stand up paddleboarding and kayaking and swimming. So, if there's no summer beach cabins available, come out and hang out in the country and go swimming in the rivers and the lakes and the dams. And then if you'd like, please feel free to buy some wine. We're not a cellar door winery. We are a cellar door winery. We're not a bottle shop winery. We don't deal with Dan Murphy's or any of those guys. We're restaurants and celladors. That's our target market. So if you like, I know everyone's got a lot of wine. I know you've invested in coming to this course, and I know a number of you are already buyers of our wine. But if you'd like to, thank you. You're welcome to have 20% off any mixed case or more. It's up to you. So if you're a wine club member, you're already beating that percentage quite dramatically at the moment. But most of all, thank you. Thanks for listening to me. I will take off share so you guys can look at each other now and if you've got any questions, like comments, what were your thoughts? What was the views on the Chardonnays?
Will, just not so much on that. I remember when we visited the winery,
Yes.
you've got another winery across the road.
Another winery across the road?
Was
On the way to Candos.
Oh, and so we're in our own valley. There's no winery specifically near us. There's a little vineyard called Naked Lady, which makes some beautiful Cabernets on the
Right.
other side of Rylstone. And there's a rundown vineyard over next to Candos, which unfortunately has gone to Rack.
and does the other one that you just mentioned, do they try to do French style wines as well, or have they got different soils? Or
It's different soils.
Yeah.
They've all had a bit of limestone in the area. Apparently, it came out of the kilns at a rate of bloody knot, so that helped the whole region. But they've got a focus on this beautiful Cabernet. Our Cabernet, quite similar to our Cabernet, really long hang time, really ripe tannins in the cab, so really lovely chocolate cherry ripe type of Cabernet. But they're about, I don't know the actual vineyard size, but it's probably 1 acre or 2 acres or something.
right, okay.
We're a different scale. We need some other wineries in our area in particular, like the way the best comparison I would give would be sort of to how crazy my parents are. I would be a little bit to what David Lett did in the United States. So he went to UC Davis back in the 50s or 60s, I think. He had a big belief in marginality, and after visiting France, spending a lot of time there. So he finished his viticulture degree at the University of California, Davis campus. Effectively, the expectation was he'd get a job in the Napa or Sonoma, and he said no, and he went up to Oregon. And they just had a big hurricane, and it had flattened and decimated all of the nut plantations. The farmers were on the bones of their ass, and he was able to pick up some land cheap, which fit his bill. And he struggled for a long time to raise awareness to be taken seriously. And he got invited by Gourmillot, which is the main food review guides internationally. They're Michelin and Gourmillot. Good Food Guide effectively is copied Gourmillot here in Australia. Gourmillot is here in Australia. We're their wine partner, interestingly, in Australia. But they invited David Lett to show his wines at their wine show in London, and he came second with his Pinot. And that was a bit mind-blowing. It was the first time an American or non-French had done well in this competition. And the Burgundians were actually really generous to him. Apparently he's a lovely person. And so the Burgundians actually invited him to show at their own competition the year after, where he came second again. So a lot of Grand Crus. He bet a lot of Grand Crus, and they were blown away. And obviously, it was a testament to him as a person that they didn't snub him. They actually befriended him, and he became very close friends with Joseph Drouhin. I don't know if you know the very famous Burgundian house, and their kids became great friends, and they used to do vintages at each other's property. This is like this crazy nutter up in Oregon, and everyone else in America is like, what idiots up there, Napa, Sonomas, everything. And so he won these awards. He said it still didn't bring him, the recognition. Like, we won best wine in Australia, and still there's a lot of people who go, who are you? And he said the same thing. And it was actually his son, Jason, who said what triggered it was that Joseph called one year, and he said, my dad thought it was, Virginie was coming over to do another vintage with us, and wasn't that going to be great? And Joseph was ringing, no. He said, mate, I bought the property next to you, and we're planting vines there. And it went from one vineyard, and there was Joseph Drouhin, so Drouhin in Oregon, which is quite famous now, and there's now 700 vineyards in that area. It's the Willamette Valley, and when you think of how like Willamette Valley now is like Central Otago, these are like vine heaven, the amount of respect people get for wines made in that area. And this gutsy guy did it by himself for a long, long time. I remember actually, sorry, that the interview finished with, I think his son, Jason, saying, I remember speaking to my mum and she was in tears, effectively, when she found out how much wine David had been putting away. He'd been building a museum, hiding it, because he was like, well, because he had the same view, you've got to be able to make wines that are good after 30 years. That's the real judgment call. And when she found out, she's like, all of the cancelled holiday, the holidays we couldn't take, all of the, we were on the knife edge of survival for 20 to 30 years. Yeah. So hats off to them.
So if you visit Ralston now, it's for wine tasting, it's really just yourselves.
Oh no! Look, it's worth going to Naked Lady. They're small, they're lovely, but from a serious end, we're there. We're the first there by quite a period of time, and but we want to build it up. We're trying, we're the wine partner now for Tourism France, and I do a lot of ambassadorial dinners now. Yeah. We've really got the French community behind us. We're actually looking at. We were supposed to be actually exporting back to Alain Decasse's restaurants, and we're going to do it. Supposed to do a dinner with Guy Savoy, who's the #1 chef in the world. He's got a restaurant in Paris. He wanted to put our wine on, so there's definitely, I can see if I can convince one of them, even via our family. So they're close to the Latours. So that's the dream run. Then I can retire and relax.
Fantastic.
Hang out with Nick. So
Will, I'm quite interested in your comments about some of the older Burgundies. In 50 years, they're still drinking brilliantly.
Exactly.
How do you see that in the context of what you're doing and what happens with the New World Burgundies, the New World Pinots, I should say?
Yeah. Well, we don't have the tannin structure in a lot of the New World Pinots to be able to get that age range. We do. We get them in by oak, but we don't have the skin tannin there. We just don't. They're Central Otago. Actually, I take that back. Willamette Valley and Central Otago, I think you could probably get. You're going to get wines out of theirs that rival Great Burgundies, and I think I taste some of them, and they're pretty bloody close to some of the best wines I've ever tasted. Australia, I don't know. Jury's out. We can make great Pinot, and it's not a bad thing having a Pinot that's phenomenally good at 5 years, because let's be frank, that's about the limit of my patience. so 30 years, 30 years is like you effectively got to it's like one of those things where you got to hide it from yourself and bury it behind tractors and everything, so you just can't get to it. And then you finally, probably more likely my daughter will find it because I will have forgotten about it, and she'll open half of them for some, underage drinking party and drink them all. So that's what I did with my dad's port. It was the only thing he forgot to lock away when I was a teenager. I was a weird kid. I was at parties. Other people would have vodka and Bacardi breezes and beers, and I would literally have a bottle of port. You've got to have high acid and you've got to have good tannins, and the tannins have got to be integrated as well. And I don't think oak integrates tannins as effectively as skin as well. Tannins, it's just, it's like co-fermentation versus blending. Co-fermentation, the wines are more integrated together than if you blend them at the end. So it's all marginality, mate. I don't think Australia's been making that level of Pinot as well for long enough yet. There are some really people who are really throwing the let's be honest, the kitchen sink at Pinots now. The jury's out. We'll have this conversation in 15 years from now.
Yeah.
What do you think? What do you think?
Being why the Pinots that we're used to in Australia don't have the staying power that the French Burgundies have.
Yeah, that's lack of skin.
They're much bigger wines.
Yeah, thick skin. Skin's flavour. You want to know how important skin is? Well, what's rosé? Rosé is red wine without skin.
Yeah.
How critical it is to flavour development. So, yeah. And that's not it. We also use a lot of Shiraz, to be honest. And Shiraz, the Hunter Valley Burgundy, it's funny, as I speak to some of the older guys around, and my father, he's now recorded this, great, I call my dad old, it's going to go down well. But I'd say like their older school voices back in the day, you know, Burgundy was a Hunter Valley wine that was mainly Shiraz with some Pinot. Shiraz, it's interesting when you go back to like the Grange. So Grange was Shiraz with some Cabernet. And so it wasn't straight Shiraz. And what Australian, some of those early winemakers got was because in that era, especially in France, the quality was a little bit all over the shop and they didn't really, you know, have as many levers. You know, even we talk about minimal impact, but you still can have some levers, you know, about temperature, fermentation and inoculation and things like that. And the way that Burgundy used to overcome underripe vintages was they'd get a little bit of juice from the Rhone Valley down south and it would appear in a tanker at the dead of night and it'd be poured into the vat with the Pinot. And the same with Bordeaux. They used to put a little bit of Shiraz in the Cabernets if there was an underripe year. So they came back with that knowledge and that became the foundation stone to a lot of Australia's great wines, that blending, the cheeky blending. And I think the Australians probably had appealed to our national psyche that, you know, it was a bit naughty, but it gave a better wine. And so, but Pinot and Shiraz is, you know, it's, you don't have to report anything on the front of a label if it's below 15%. So, you know, there's a lot of Pinots in Australia that are 14.9% Shiraz and 75.1% Pinot. So
Exactly, yeah.
But, you know, as I said, if it makes a great wine and I'm loving drinking it, it was well done. So if it made a terrible, if it was going to be a terrible wine without it, well, it's a bloody waste. And I know how hard it is to be a winemaker and a vineyard these days. And, you know, you got to make a wine that's good. So you have to. So what are people's hands up for the Jeanette or the Comtesse? Which was the Jeanette?
Jeanette.
I didn't mind the Comtesse. I just thought it was just like a really good veranda wine.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it depends what you're
The
drinking
occasion.
with, really. Yeah.
Yeah,
What you're going to eat with it.
yeah. I think that's probably it to a nutshell. Like the Comtesse, like we were at a restaurant, Urbane in Brisbane, #1 restaurant in Queensland. That was their house wine. It was still a Comtesse. They sold it for like $80 a bottle. Like Three Hat restaurants have got a higher price point, but they'd sell a lot of it for $80 a bottle. I remember going, wow, that's not cheap. But so it does have the respect. It's just not overly complicated. So and that's, but you know, as I said, is not every wine needs to be a complicated, you know, blends and this and that. The tinkering, I think, is the danger in wine. Is, you know, it's the confidence to take your hand off the tiller and let the wind blow you forward. So I'm going to put that on my quote somewhere.
So do you think people are fiddling too much these days, Will?
I think we're stopping. I think it's reducing. I think definitely in the 80s, in the 90s and thousands, 100%. It was, you know, like you can go and you can speak to there are chemical producers and the stuff that you can do to wine with making some additives at the end of the winemaking process is phenomenal. It's like chalk and cheese, and there's a lot of tricks played. You know, it always stuns me how much the big commercial wineries, how many big trophies they win, and then you realize that it's the one barrel, you know, that they've put to one side and tweaked or pulled every lever under the sun, and you know, it's nothing close to what you're actually ever going to buy in the bottle shop. So I think, I think people are appreciating, you know, as I said at the start, you know, we're starting to understand the terroir and working with it, you know, the varieties in particular is a big one. I think that's, you know, if you're still growing Chardonnay in a warm climate, you know, it's a style that doesn't really appeal to me very much. I think it's a very tough style to sell anymore. But that same climate, you know, pull it out and put, you know, Tempranillo in, bang, you're going to start making a really great wine that you don't need to mess around with. And I think that's probably, you know, I'm probably pointing at Hunter Valley there. You know, they're saying to make some really good warm climate. Mudgee too. Mudgee's got cool and warm up there, and but there's some great wineries up in Mudgee that are making Spanish Friar, like Vinifera. Like some of the stuff is phenomenal, and it's beautiful, and it's Spanish variety. So I think that's probably it. If you've got the varieties right, you can get away with a lot. Otherwise, you're fighting it. Does that answer the question? Or was that a really long way?
No, I think that does.
I didn't do one of these premiers COVID briefings, did I? Where I didn't really answer the question. I talked for half an hour. Anyway, so
You didn't say please no. Please no.
Please no. Okay, got it. So what else?
Best contact tracers in the world.
Best contract, exactly. Gold standard wine. But from all of you guys, look, it's. I hope you enjoyed them. What's the view on the Pinot? Are you noticing it's opening up? Those of you decanted some of it. It was a big.
Yeah, very nice.
Delicious. Very good.
Oh, good. Well, hopefully I'll get to show you a couple more in a couple of years. So we've got the reserve being made next year, which will be exciting. My father's most excited. So the Jeanette is named after my mum, and the reserve Pinot will be named after my father, it'll be the Richard. So, which is, I think, my parents resisted it initially. Oh, we don't want to name wines after ourselves. I'm like, you know what? When you've gone to all this effort and all this risk, you could have take the credit while you can. And you know what? It's a legacy. So, my job is to make damn sure over the next 20, 30 years, they become iconic wines. So
who's Percival?
Yeah, so they're all family stories. So that story is a little bit older. So our family arrived in 1390s in an area which is now called Bresse. We have a town there which is our family castle, Beaurepaire-en-Bresse, and it's and we had a lot of that land was right in the border with the Holy Roman Empire. So our family's job was to defend effectively a large part of the border with the Germans on the other side. But the name, but we go back a couple more generations before that, and there was a story written at the court of Murray of Champagne, and Murray of Champagne was Eleanor of Aquitaine's daughter. She was the two daughters she had to leave behind when she divorced the King of France and became the wife of the King of England. But Mary of Champagne was a big believer in the arts, and she what's the term? She had a poet, one of the number one romance writers in poets in Europe, was in her court, like a Chrétien de Troyes, and her court was in Troyes, as you look at it on a map. And he wrote the first, it was called Le Conte de Graal. It's the first writing of the Holy Grail. So well before this is the first written record of it. And it was a love story. It was actually the first medieval romance. And in that story, the knight Percival is out to find the Fisher King. And let's be honest, Pinot Noir, so is called the Holy Grail in wine. Sangreal, wines by far. A lot of people call it the Grail. And so it was appropriate for one. And then the second part, which is where our surname came from, was so on that quest to find the Fisher King, he came across a castle, and there was a damsel she wasn't a damsel, she was the commander of the castle, she was the lady of the castle, and under siege and losing, and he fell in love with her and lifted the siege through single combat. And that lady was a lady called Blanchefleur, which is the name of one of our sparklings. And the castle was the castle of Beaurepaire. Right. And so good hideaway, the connections, that's our family story. So my ancestor was Marie of Champagne. So her daughter was a lady called Scholastic, who married William of Macon. So Mâconnais, and then through X generations, I guess at some point, either they said, oh, I like that surname, or when they got the land and built the castle in Bresse, they called it Beaurepaire, and a lot of like Leonardo da Vinci, the name, he was from Vinci. So then stuck to us. So
right.
they're all a little bit of, they're all nice stories. There's no holy grail as far as I can read when you read the story. It was a romance book, and it was about a dish and a lance, and the guy never actually bloody found the thing either, so he wasn't successful. But it's a nice old story, and it sort of ties together. I think we make our sparkling, a Blanc de Blanc, so obviously Blanchefleur, the court of Champagne and being a white flower, and Percival being the quest for the Holy Grail. We just thought they were appropriate names. So.
Okay, thank you.
So
Well,
you
you
said
said
wine to call the Sophie, I'm guessing.
Yeah, mate. Yeah, you're right. So obviously, the sparkling is the spark. What is, the Annabelle sparkling rosé is named after my oldest daughter, who's just awake now. That's not a good sign. So yeah, so that was my parents' idea. Great idea, because it's created a monster, which means we now have to name another wine after another daughter. And fortunately, we've got a Pinot Gris coming out around Christmas, so we called Sophie. So which would be lovely. Yeah, a Pinot Gris.
Congratulations.
Thanks, John. Thank you. Yeah, it's it's great. Like, we have 2 daughters. I'm a father of girls, which is, if they're going to rule the world, at least, I want to be friends with the bosses. But yeah, they'll be lucky girls going into their adult years with wines, and their father, on the other hand, won't have a wine.
Well, you said you want to make a reserve Pinot.
Mhm.
What's the criteria for that?
The criteria is going to be come down to the clones. So understanding and making wines on the clones. It'll be more hand-picked fruit, so it's really going to be much more hand-sorted. Really making sure there's no impurities in the wine as well, and then it'll be extended aging after that. So there'll be an additional 12 months in oak. It'll be a slower ferment as well. There's no rush. The thing is slowing the whole bloody thing down. Like, we're not trying to beat the market with a reserve. The whole purpose of reserves was to reserve them from release, to take time. So that's the that used to be 5 years. Let's be frank, I think even we've shortened it a little bit with our wines, because just that's the market conditions, and we've all lost so many vintages to some bad conditions in the last 3 or 4 years. So that's it. So hopefully a 4 or 5 year age before release. Much more a blending table decision about which clones to use and in what proportion. Overall, I just want to slow the ferment down as well. So if we can, we'll see. It may be terrible. Dad may get a terrible wine named after him, but I doubt it somehow. I'm going to be left with a Spumante or something like that. So. But thank you.
Don't be too hard on yourself.
Oh, it's all right, John. Okay, don't worry. Mother Nature's hard enough as it is. So you develop a fairly laconic, what's it going to do to me this time? So we just activated our new temperature sensors, and I was looking at I got the call from the probe guy this morning. It's set up. Here's the link, and I look it up straight away. I was like, oh great, -6, and we're getting very close to bud burst, and the bud burst is the next couple of weeks, and I'm like. Not this year. So it was -6 would be just very destructive on the buds. So fortunately, we got a couple of weeks. Fortunately, we got an incredible vineyards operations manager who's now been a number of years. Who's just, he's got an incredible agricultural brain. Like I said, just practically minded, and he just watches and he's passionate about it. And he's really invested in the quality and the longevity of the property now, and well, always, but more so now than ever. And we're trialing different things to defend us against frost. So, this is the dark arts. We've got frost fans. You're looking at using Amigo. Well, in America, they use Amigo oil. It's canola oil sprays that coats the buds, and it delays the bud burst by 2 or 3 or 4 days. So everything you're trying to do is just push back bud burst by, a week or 2 weeks, because you can't stop the damage, but you can limit the time that the buds are bursting during frost period. So our frost period finishes around Melbourne Cup Day. So that's a lot. So bud burst is normally late September. So normally we've got about a month exposed. So if we can push back a week or 2 weeks, we've halved our exposure to frost. So yeah, somehow. So I'll thank you, everyone. You got happy to take any more questions, but otherwise really appreciated having you guys on. Really appreciated chatting and letting me talk so much about wine. And happy to. Obviously, we've got more
That's great.
classes. Yeah. Sorry, what was that?
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Oh,
No,
it's
thank you.
just
very
saying
much.
how good it was,
Very good.
Will. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Victoria. No, it's a pleasure. So you're never sure if you're just talking too much, but fortunately, it's wine,
Exactly.
and you got 3 bottles. So the longer I talk, probably the less guilty you felt drinking them. I got to keep drinking while I was talking. You know, open another one.
Oh, dear.
But
No,
please,
excellent.
That was good.
no problem. And please, if
Thank you.
come along to more if you want, or if you're in Sydney, sorry, John, but when you are in Sydney, we're doing these wine dinners every week. So if you're interested, you know, go and have a look online or send me an email or a message, and there's a couple coming up.
No, definitely.
Yeah, but otherwise, I will see you all very soon. Thanks, guys.
Mm.
Thanks,
Wonderful.
Will.
Okay,
Excellent.
thanks, Will.
Thanks, Will.
My
Bye.
pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you.